it? Okay, there. Perfect. So like I said, some quick introductions for today. So we are joined by Dr. Robert Marzano. He is the co-founder and chief academic officer for Marzano Resources. He is the founder of the Marzano Academies, and then we are lucky enough to have him as the executive director for Empower Learning. So he has been in the field of education for 53 years now. And in that time, he's worked with educators both as a speaker and a trainer, and continues to do those things today. So he's authored more than 50 books and 300 articles, and those span just a multitude of topics, including today's topic, assessment, instruction, writing and implementing proficiency scales, which is very germane to the topic today, cognition, effective leadership, and school intervention. So his research-based strategies are known internationally and are really widely practiced by both classroom teachers and educational leaders worldwide. So welcome, Dr. Marzano. And then Scott Bacon is, as I mentioned previously, the founder and chief R&D officer for Empower Learning. And he is a pioneer, been a thought partner to many systems implementing competency-based education throughout, I believe it is almost, or somewhere in the neighborhood of 18 years, if I have that right. And he's also an innovator of the earliest sustained models of competency-based education. So Scott's contributions have really helped drive the conversation around the innovation that is competency-based education. So welcome to both of you. And so part of this is, and I am going to turn things over to Dr. Marzano, but before I do that, part of our purpose today is to introduce something that we're extremely excited about here at Empower Learning, and that is the brand new Center for Competency-Based Assessment. So you're seeing the logo that we've designed for it there. And the first questions that come up are kind of like, with a center, what is a center, and why did we set about creating it? So first up, the what is a center? This is really a hub for assessment services and resources that is specifically aligned to the arena of competency-based education. And maybe the best way to illustrate that is really to take us out to a newly created section of our website. If I can, let me stop sharing for just a moment here. Get us over there, and I will share screen again and walk you through this really quickly. So when I mention a hub, I'm really referring to several big areas that we're going to address through the Center for Competency-Based Assessment. Those are professional development and topics like classroom assessment using proficiency scales. Dr. Marzano, I believe, will address part of that in his content today. A couple of topics around assessment literacy, which is a topic that's really not well covered in teacher education programs. So two of them are maybe assessment types and really opening up the world to classroom teachers of what could be considered an assessment and how might we use that opening up to track student progress, as well as how do we create reliable and valid classroom assessments that are aligned to the proficiency scales that we put in place, using classroom assessment data to inform instruction. And then, of course, we will work with schools and districts on customized needs that relate to assessment. In addition to that, Dr. Marzano leads for us custom consulting and development work around competency-based assessment. And part of that could be evaluation of existing common and benchmark assessments, like alignment of existing assessments to scales, item validity analysis, feedback revision, and then classroom assessment reliability calculation, as well as a number of other topics that you can get to through our website. And then one area that I know Dr. Marzano will focus on a bit peripherally is the Marzano Growth Calculator tool that we have developed and is a free resource out there for teachers to assess student growth using classroom assessments. So As well as that, we have a number of resources that you can access, including previous webinars. This webinar will be posted in this spot here. And with that said, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Marzano. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Sean. Appreciate that very well. Welcome to everybody. Let me see here. I'm going to share my screen. And presumably you can see the PowerPoints. Tell me yes. Correct? We're good. Okay. So as Sean said, this was, well, first of all, I've been, formerly part of Empower for a few years now, but have known Empower and worked with Empower for well over a decade. My background in terms of competency-based education goes back to the early 90s. Actually, the first book I ever wrote on the topic was in 1996. So that's, over 2 decades of being involved. And when I asked Scott to come on and explain his background, but he already kind of alluded to that. In terms of Empower, I think this is the LMS system that has been in existence for longer than any other relative to competency-based education. So we believe that in this arena, competency-based education, not just the assessment part, we know as much as anybody, if not more. And, I'm sure not arrogantly thinking we feel like we know actually quite a bit about this CBE and also assessment. And that's why we wanted to establish this the center. These webinars we will continue to do generally once a month. Each one is very focused, relatively short. They'll always be free, and we'll be adding free resources to the website as we go on. But as Sean mentioned, our major purpose is to, through professional development consulting, help schools and districts design competency-based systems or take the CB system they have now and make it better. The topic I'm going to address has some technical parts and some non-technical parts. If you want to read the technical background to some of the content I'm presenting, I recommend this book, The Art and Science of Classroom Assessment. Like I say, these will all be short, but the idea is be very focused and give you some new perspectives. And hopefully you'll walk away from each one of these webinars with at least one new way of looking at things or one new idea. So today it's classroom assessment in the CBE system. The presentation here assumes a few things. One is that you have topics at each grade level and subject area, and that's a whole arena in and of itself. How do you identify CBE topics? How many should you have? What should they look like? And that topic itself will be the subject of a webinar not too far in the future. But that's an assumption that a school who wants to create a CBE system has for each grade level and subject area topics. I like to call them measurement topics for each grade level and subject area. And that they're focused, they cover the content adequately. And again, I'm sure right now you're saying, well, gee, how many should we have and what do they look like? And again, that's the topic for another session. Although that book I just mentioned addresses this if you're interested in kind of giving a quick look at, well, where will we be going? Step number one, given that you have a measure, that you have your topics, if you're going to create assessments, competency-based assessments, you have to create what people used to call scoring guides. Now, we're going to call them proficiency scales. Proficiency scales are used all across the country. I believe I coined that term in the early 1990s. We have a particular view what proficiency scales should look like, but they're not new, as I say. They used to be called scoring guides. Scoring guides, however, didn't have all of the detail that a proficiency scale does. But a scoring guide was always intended to identify what's the content that will be addressed in this assessment, and not just a listing of the content, but actually stratifying that content in terms of its level of difficulty. So in general, scoring guides had at least 3 levels of difficulty. It was kind of the easy stuff, and then the content that was more complex than that usually was considered, boy, this is what we're really shooting for here. Students know this content, and then some content that was kind of advanced. So that's the essence of a proficiency scale. My point here is that that's not a new concept. It's the basis of assessment design, and it has been for decades and decades. I would assert over a century. Now, unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. Teacher design assessments, it's not. I've seen practice over the years where someone would be using a textbook and just go to the back of the chapter and pull out some items and throw them together. That's not a well-designed assessment. You have to have thought through what's my content, but also what are the levels of difficulty of that content. If you're going to create a scoring guide, that means have the levels. But then if you want to turn that into a proficiency scale, it just means add to those levels, and you don't have to add new content. Now, if you're familiar with our work, you've seen this before. The 3 levels of content that we say you should have are at the 3.0 level, and that's usually considered proficiency by people. This measurement topic dealing with organisms, so the student will understand organisms have unique and diverse life cycles, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's simpler basic content that will probably be directly taught. Student will really recognize or recall specific vocabulary, such as, this is an elementary example, and then above. In addition to the score 3.0 performance, the student will demonstrate in-depth inferences and applications, and usually an example of that is given. For example, they can compare and contrast the life cycle of 2 different organisms and do things with that information. Now, you fill that in, by having a level 1 and a level 0. Level 1 is the student cannot they can't demonstrate competence in these 3 levels on their own, but with help, they can demonstrate, partial competence. A 0 means even with help, they can't demonstrate partial competence. And I always like to say that a 0 should never occur. If with help, a student can't demonstrate competence in one or more of the levels of content you've identified, there's probably something more wrong with the help than there is with the student. Now, in our proficiency scale, we also add half-point scores, which, as the name would indicate, that represents competence halfway between one level and another. So look at the 2.5. That basically says no major errors or omissions in the 2.0 content. Notice, no major errors or omissions in the content listed for 2.0. 2.5 though says that there'll be no major errors in the 2.0 level, but partial understanding, at the 3.0 level. So it's a very simple logic. Now, by the way, this particular proficiency scale, this format, took really years to develop. Well, I've tried, I don't know how many, I want to say at least 10 different versions of proficiency scales. And this one works. It's intuitive, it's accurate, it's amenable to scoring. And that's what I've been using for a number of years now. Now, once you have a scoring guide turned into a proficiency scale, boy, you've got something that's very, very powerful. You can create assessments from that. And in general, not all the time, an assessment will address all 3 of those levels. That'll have simpler content for the score 2.0 level, target content for the score 3.0 level, and then more advanced content. So it'll have 3 parts to it. And you can develop multiple tests from one proficiency scale. So here we're using that same proficiency scale. So part 1 would be the simpler content. That's the 2.0 content. Put an X beside each object that is part of the life cycle for an organism. You get the idea. Many times the score 2.0 content is selected response items. Part 2, describe the basic pattern of the life cycle. Explain the life cycle of one of the following creatures. That's more, they're usually more constructed response. And part 3, compare the life cycle of 2 different organisms, of 2 different organisms. So going back to the proficiency scale / the scoring guide, now you've got the framework to develop multiple types of assessments. Even around the same topic. Now you can imagine if a school gets together and creates its topics and its proficiency scales, that becomes a powerful grounding tool for all teachers to create their own types of assessments, even though they're using different items, they're assessing the same thing. Even more powerful when assessments are designed using collaborative teams within the PLC process. Here's an assessment or test might be generated out of the same proficiency scale. Part one, identify each element of the life cycle in the picture. Simpler content. Part two, write a description of what is happening in the picture in part one of the test. And then part three, again, has to do with a comparison activity. So scoring guides can be translated into proficiency scales. Proficiency scales can be translated into assessments, classroom tests. And that's kind of the general framework. The kind of work that is involved in creating a scoring guide or proficiency scale is take the content related to a particular topic and organize it into those levels of difficulty. And that's not a simple task. It's not a hard task, but it's not a simple one. I should say it's a straightforward task, but not necessarily an easy one. What you'll find is if you look at standard statements at the district level, school level, national level, and if you pull them apart, you'll get a whole list of little pieces, not so little, I should say, of pieces that relate to a given topic. Like this comes from the topic of functions, at a secondary level. Now, that's why standards, as currently stated, aren't really good guides or tools for teachers to use to create assessments or even to create instructional lessons or units, because it's kind of unrelated, related, I should say, topics, but not organized into any continuum of knowledge, simple, target, and more complex. So once you have package standards, now it's a matter of saying, what do we want to assess, and how do we put that together? What do we put at what level? And those are decisions that are partially constrained by, not constrained, partially guided by how teaching will occur, what will be directly taught, what won't be directly taught. So this is a proficiency scale coming right from that previous list, where the science teachers who got together to create this made decisions about what goes at the 2.0 level, what goes at the 3.0 level, and what goes at the 4.0 level. Now, there are many areas you can go to get examples of these. Again, that's the subject of a whole other webinar. We've got some examples at Empower Learning. Marzano Resources sells what are called the critical concepts, which are great places to start. Or schools and districts can create their own, kind of starting from square one. Again, once you have a proficiency scale, now the creation of assessment, multiple assessments, is pretty straightforward in that you'll have a part for the score 2 content, a part for the score 3.0 content, and a part for the score 4.0 content. So three parts. Now, let me go in a little more depth here, because that's kind of the general process. Topics, proficiency scales, create assessments from them. Not quite that simple, though. And if you've done this, you probably found that out already. How do you score tests? And what type of different tests? I showed you very traditional tests, or are there some other tests or assessments that you can use? And the answer is yes. And for each type of assessment / test, you're going to have a different type of scoring. Probably the most common one that people gravitate to is what I'll call point scoring. And this looks very, very familiar, at least in part. This would be a test that had 3 parts: score 2.0 content, score 3.0, and 4.0 content. And each section had a number of items. The score 2.0 content had 6 items. And each item had points assigned to it. So 5 points for each of the 6 items. Score 3.0 had 2 items that on that content, came right from the proficiency scale, but those were 10-point items. And score 4.0 had 2 items, and each of those were worth 20 points. Looks traditional so far. But now when you score it, you still score each item for the points, and you can see that on the far, not the far right, but the column second to the right, to the far right, the fourth column in, and that's how many points a particular student received. Now, traditionally, if we were scoring this test, we would just, add up all the points the student received and then divide by the total number of points. That's not how you score in a competency-based system, particularly if you're using a scoring guide, or in this case, proficiency scales. You have to kind of score it level by level. And the process goes something like this. Is there enough evidence for me to say on this test, they're a 2.0? If yes, let me go on to the 3.0. Is there enough evidence to say students are 3.0? If yes, let me go to the 4.0 content. That's the general progression, of decision-making when scoring a test like this. So you can still, looks very traditional here. You can still add up the points. So this particular student out of the 30 possible points, for the score, the first part scored 2 points, the student got 25 out of 30, or 83%. Now, here's a big decision point. You have to, given your scoring using proficiency scale scoring, you have to say, is that enough evidence to say that on this test, I would rate the student, at least the 2.0 level? Some people say, well, they didn't get them all right. If you notice the way our proficiency scales are designed, it doesn't say they have to all be correct. That what it does say is there are no major errors or omissions. Now, if the teacher looks at this and says, 25, actually the one question the student missed, item number 3, I'm not even sure if he just understood that, but it looks like, at 2.0 level, I don't see any major errors and omissions. Now let's go up to the 3.0 level. So a tentative decision of at least a 2.0 has been made. Now let's go up to the 3.0 level. Okay, student has 13 of the 20 possible points. Teacher says, is that enough to say that no major errors or omissions, have been made? And the answer is probably not. If you're using kind of a percentage approach, when you start getting below 80% of the items or the points at a particular level, then it's hard to say, that the points they didn't receive are just from careless errors or omissions. You get below about that 80%. Now you have to start saying, that I don't see enough for 3.0 there. I really don't. That's where the half point scores come in. So a teacher might say, okay, I don't see a 2.0, but I'm at 2.5. I could see that. Now there is 4.0 content, and you might think, well, just don't even score those. We always say, no, score it. That's information, and report that back to the student. But what gets recorded on this particular assessment for a student is that they received a 2.5. Now, that's a very different way of doing business. And a reaction might be, oh my gosh, is this less accurate than just adding up the points? And the answer is no, it's not less accurate. It's actually more accurate. Now, again, that's the subject of a whole other webinar, but we'll give you a resource at the end of this, where a pretty detailed paper that talks about that. One part of the literacy we want to create around competency-based education deals with the fact, literacy around competency-based assessment deals with the fact that a single score on a single test for an individual student always has error built in. And I think one of the most egregious errors that is being made out there in competency-based systems is that we have one test for a topic that if a student passes that test or gets a score on that test, that's the score we ascribe to the students. And I will guarantee there's almost always error in that score. So there's a lot of the teacher using all of the information available to assign a score on a test. Another version of kind of a traditional scoring is what we call response code scoring. And there you don't assign points, but what you do is you do code student responses as to correct, that would be a C, that's completely correct, incorrect, I, or partially correct, PC. And actually secondary people sometimes do low partial, high partial. And so in this case, the student is actually the same pattern as before. For the score 2.0, correctly answered 5 of the 6 questions and incorrectly answered 1 of them, partial correct in the score 3.0, and then incorrect in the score 4.0 items. Again, same score, 2.5 on this. How, again, a question that comes up with this type of scoring is, what about aberrant patterns? And an aberrant pattern is, well, wait a minute. I had it designed so that there was simple content and then more complex content, and actually 3 levels of that, but the student did well on the harder stuff. How can that possibly be the case? Well, a lot of reasons could create that scenario. One reason might be that actually your proficiency scale was off, that your content for the 3.0 or the 4.0 can actually be known by students or accomplished by students without knowing the score 2.0 content. It can also just be error in the system, and aberrant patterns commonly occur when a student is paying attention to some items and not to others. Now, by the way, aberrant patterns occur even when test-making companies create assessments, so they're not unusual. And what you do is you just, when you see an aberrant pattern, you try to figure out why and make corrections. For example, the questions were poorly written. Question didn't accurately reflect the level of proficiency on the scale. You had an item you thought was 2.0 was really 3.0. The student was rushed or tired. The student did not understand the question is written. Teacher evaluation, the student's response was incorrect. My point here is that assessment, particularly of knowledge and skill, it's not a precise science, and it's not a precise science even with SAT and ACT. The aberrant patterns occur in their test design too. They just spend a lot of money correcting those aberrant patterns over time. That's your traditional test. You can use proficiency scales also, with traditional tests like essays. The trick here is that when you design your essay, you do so in a way that you have questions represent all 3 content levels of the proficiency scale. So what makes a great motivational speaker? Upon the conclusion of the study, and you get the idea. I won't read the whole question to you, but this was on using Henry V, Act 4, Scene 3, the questions based on students' reading of that and understanding of that content are still broken into the level 2, the level 3, and the level 4 content. Look at the content. Look at question 1, level 2. Identify Henry's emotional plea to motivate his troops. Now that's just right there. It's right there in the content, and it's very simple. If the student understands, Act 4, Scene 3, they're going to be able to answer that. Questions 2 and 3 all deal with level 3. Address Henry's credibility as a king of the people as opposed to a tyrant, so on and so forth. So, still a question which asks students a constructive response question, but now it gets at content that's not just, there, for the reading. The student has to interpret what something that occurred or a character's actions and provide evidence for that. Look at the last question, level 4. Make a claim about Henry's speech, make a claim about how Henry's speech could compare to political or military leaders in the 20th century, or 21st century in this case. Now that's something that goes above and beyond the content that was taught. Now you score it the same way. You would first look at the level 2.0 question, how well they do, and then go to the level 3 questions, et cetera, et cetera. Again, point scoring could be used. This is for that example we just have, item A, B, C, and D. All were worth 10 points. Points earned, again, use point scoring to come up with a score for the student. Same thing with the response code. So essays, as long as they're designed so that they have prompts for each of the 3 levels, you can score them on a proficiency scale. Here's performance assessment, scored very similar to an essay, but again, you have to set it up in such a way that there are prompts / questions at each level of the proficiency scale, the score 2.0 level, score 3.0 level, and the score 4.0 level. The Federal Commission, FCC, has released a plan to repeal net neutrality, so we have been studying the concept of free markets and consumer rights. So the teachers referring students back to what they've already read. So this is a test on that content that has been addressed in class. Okay, now, as part of this assignment, you will work in teams to prepare a short written description of your position and defend your positions in a classroom debate. And again, 3 different levels. Supporters of net neutrality rules say consumers need protection. Identify consumer rights that net neutrality rules may protect. That's content that was directly taught, basic factual information, score 2.0 content. Second question, explain how net neutrality rules restrict a free market system. That's asking for students to provide examples. And question 3, at the 4.0 level, asks for students to generate information, goes above and beyond what was in the proficiency scale. So different types of assessments. You can, as long as you set them up in such a way that you have prompts, which are identified, which are focused at the score 2.0 content, 3.0 or 4.0, you've got some assessments easily scored with proficiency skills. Let me go a little further now. We believe, and I firmly believe, that you have to not only look at the content, but also the nature of the content, whether it's declarative or procedural. And there's at least 2 types of procedural knowledge. Declarative knowledge is informational in nature. If you're designing an assessment that is for a topic that's declarative in nature, it's pretty straightforward to design traditional assessments. Part 1, that's a level 2 content. This is a science topic on weather, typical selected response items, and those would cover the content that was directly taught, some vocabulary terms, some basic facts here. Part 2, would be a little more constructed response. List 3 important weather conditions you can measure. Which tools would you use to explain those weather conditions, et cetera, et cetera. So that's second part of the test, level 3. Part 4, explain under what conditions you could reasonably predict the following weather events. Tornado, hurricane, that is much more students applying their knowledge. So again, you can use point scoring for each one of these sections. You can use the response coding section and come up with an overall score on a proficiency scale. How about traditional tests using procedural knowledge? Now, procedural knowledge, by definition, is something that students have to do. For example, reading a contour map would be procedural knowledge. It's an act, it's a set of steps students have to perform when they're reading a certain type of map. Now, what isn't obvious is that all procedural knowledge has declarative knowledge embedded in it. And that declarative knowledge is some of the first content that you teach when teaching a procedure, as in, reading a contour map. Now, those types of, that type of content, that type of, the informational part of a procedure lends itself to traditional tests again. So these are items, that would be used for the declarative part of the procedure called reading a contour map. I think this is a contour map, I'm not sure. Yeah, sure, that is, yeah. And some of it's fairly sophisticated, but it's all about understanding, how a contour map is set up, what the different sections mean, what the different colors mean. But that's score 2.0 content. To actually assess students on their ability to use the process of reading a contour map, the assessment would have to include a contour map that students read and then could interpret. So that's an important aspect of assessment relative to a proficiency scale. If it's procedural knowledge, at the 3.0 level where they're using the procedure, they have to demonstrate it in some way. It doesn't lend itself as easily to your traditional selected response items, or even short constructed response. There are also psychomotor procedural skills, psychomotor. And that's, phys ed teachers deal with these all the time, how to throw a baseball, how certain moves within a certain type of game. And again, at the 2.0 level, that's still informational in nature. This is grade 7. This is about throwing, how to throw a certain type of object. And as you can see, the first part is all about, information. Look at the short answers. Where should your toe point when you release a baseball? What does a follow through? What does a follow through improve? Why does a follow through improve the accuracy of a throw? It's fairly sophisticated stuff, but it's all about how you throw, baseball, I guess, in this case. The actual 3.0 content would have to be students demonstrating it. So the type of knowledge that you have also mediates the type of tests that you can create and how you will score that. Again, essays, are ways of getting at the declarative knowledge that's part of a proficiency scale on procedural knowledge. Same thing, but again, they actually would have to perform the procedure to show you that they can do it. True performance assessment, they're actually doing it. For example, this would be in maybe a health class or where you're looking at diet, create a menu and time plan for a Thanksgiving family dinner for 20 people that includes turkey and other traditional foods. The meal must also meet the needs of people who are vegan, gluten intolerant, so on and so forth. Now it's the creation of the menu, where they would be demonstrating the procedure of being able to plan and execute a meal for a number of people. Let me go to some other types of assessments. All of these are based on the assumption that you have, a proficiency scale or a scoring guide that you're using. Probing discussions, observations, checklists. Probing discussion is when you sit down with a student, proficiency scale in hand, and you say, okay, Bob, let's start with the 2.0 content. Explain that to me. And see, it's really kind of like an essay, except it's verbal. Nice part about a probing discussion is that you can actually have the student go back and explain that a little more. So when you get an aberrant response pattern from students, you can go back and clean that up on the spot. Observations commonly occur with procedural knowledge, where you see a student throwing a baseball, out at recess, and that's been taught. Now you can actually record that and put that down as a score for students. And for the 2.0 content, some teachers actually use checklists. But again, the proficiency scale is the place to start. But again, they're not anything new when you think in terms of the scoring guides that were always an aspect of test design. Let me go to student-led assessments. Excuse me. Two types, student-generated and student self-assessment. Now, student self-assessment, just what it sounds like, where the student says, let me do student-generated. Student-generated assessment is when the student says, let me prove to you that I'm a score 3.0. And you say, well, how are you going to do that? And I get to choose how I'm going to do that. That choice has to be sanctioned by the teacher, but I get to say, well, I'm going to explain it. I'm going to write it out. Or I'm going to do a little video of myself explaining it. Or I will do a little video of myself demonstrating it. Student-generated assessments that the teacher then scores. Student self-assessment is a little bit different. Again, everything starts with the proficiency scale. In this case, this is the a health unit. The target is the student understands the effect of specific foods that we eat on our bodies. So that's the template for design. But now, when that is introduced, the teacher introduces the scale, but also introduces what we call a personal tracking matrix. And that's where the individual elements of the proficiency scale have each been separated out and given their own row in this little matrix here. So let me go back to the scale here for a second. we're just talking about the 2.0, the 3.0, and the 4.0 content, because those are the levels where content is explicit. But each one of the pieces for each one of those three areas has its own row. Now, the student will have this and fill it out periodically or daily over a unit. And notice the rating system that's used. I'm still confused about this topic. I've learned some, but not all of this topic. I've got this now, or something to that effect. Notice the student scores themselves, but the important part is the very last column, which says my evidence. And that's where the student has to record his or her evidence. Now, the teacher will periodically collect these from students or sit down with the student and say, let me look at this, Bob. How'd you do? You actually looks like you've got all the 2, and you say also the 3.0 content. Here's your evidence. And those might be assignments the students have done, specific activities the students have done, tests the teachers have done, the students keeping track of all this. And the teacher would say, I'm good. You've given me enough evidence here. Yeah, I'm going to record a 3.0 now, for you on this particular topic. So many different versions of this. Actually, this is the continuation of the same personal tracking matrix. So the design of a test, an assessment in a competency-based system for us has to start from a list of topics, that represent the content at a specific grade level and subject area. And it also has to, those topics have to have scoring guides or proficiency scales, that anchor them. And then the assessments are designed based on those. And given the type of content that is being addressed, you're going to use different type of assessments and score them in different ways. And again, this book is the place you might want to look if you want the more technical aspects of this. So what I'd like to do is go back to the center. Sean, I'm going to stop sharing. Can we show that again?
Yeah, let me share screen.
Yeah, and I'd like to show you, I mentioned a resource that's already there. And one of the characteristics of the center is that what we will do is continually put free resources. So one resource is there right now is the, we call the growth calculator. And it can be done with an individual class, with multiple classes. There's a tutorial there, as you see the Marzano growth calculator, but also there's a paper explaining in depth, but non-technical terms, the whole notion of, what reliability is when you're looking at growth, even pointing out some of the problems with that I mentioned about a single test. Sean, would you click on that paper that's there? So there's a couple of ways you can look at this. One is just to read it online. So once you click the arrow there, if you don't want to download it. Yeah, so you can just read it online. Just keep going. I actually want to show you one part that I was alluding to. So this is detailed, but not technical, and it really, I just stop right there. Yeah, go back one. Actually, those 2 pages, so pages, I can't read what pages they are, deal with my claim, this supports that claim, that any single test that a student takes, the score for that student will almost always have error built in, much more error than you think, and this growth calculator, again, an individual teacher can use it to get the best score. Actually go over some, keep going to the right, Sean. It'll compute 3 different mathematical models for each student. It'll recommend the best summative score for that student. As I say, all, completely free. It can also be used to look at the average growth for one group of students versus another group of students on the same topic. Now, Sean, would you go up to the little icon where they can download the PDF? Yeah, if you go up there, there's a PDF. So I kind of breeze through, those statements about the unreliability of a single test, but as an indication of what the center is designed to do, we will have resources like this that we continually add. The next one coming up is a resource for how to compute the reliability of a single test scored using a proficiency scale when it's scored by more than one teacher. You know, in other words, inter-rater reliability, and compute a rigorous reliability for that. And so that is coming. That said, again, we will, on these webinars, take a little piece, you know, try to give you some new ideas, new ways of looking at it, always be demonstrating resources. We'd love to work with you, and that would include creating assessments with you, analyzing what you have right now, examining the reliability and validity of your classroom assessments relative to a CBE system. That is all the stuff that we can do and would like to do with you. I would like to ask Scott now to give the broader perspective on, you know, the history of Empower Learning, a very impressive history, and actually the LMS that supports all of this. You know, the center, you can use the center content, you know, without using the LMS, but ultimately having an LMS, you know, that has all of this together is probably the best solution. So Scott and I met many, many years ago. I joined Empower like 4 years ago, and it's been a real joy and blessing for me. And I think Scott is one of the unsung heroes in competency-based education. Okay, he has generated much of the change that has already occurred and will occur. Scott.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, very kind. I had the privilege of basically entering into Another Man's Slavers back in 2003. Bob has, of course, laid out the groundwork, the theory, the process. And then in 2003, I was able to just learn. I learned about what was, it was explained to me in the term of what's called standards-based education at that time. And I was working, trying to get my own child into education, and a charter school in Anchorage, Alaska started explaining to me this method of education that really struck me. And they asked some real simple questions. Stuff you could almost not say no to. They would ask me, hey, do you think that we should meet your child at the point of her need? I said, yes, I think you should. Do you think that we should ensure that your child has mastery of prerequisite knowledge before they begin new learning endeavors? And I thought, well, that would be great. Otherwise, they're not set up for success in new learning. And then they also said, do you believe your child or children in general may learn in different ways? You know, there's you know, maybe visually, auditory, kinesthetic, or just different interests and all this kind of stuff. Would you like it so they're not just limited to have to learn everything, you know, just out of the textbook? I thought, what a beautiful world that would be. And that was my introduction into that. And then they started to show me what a proficiency scale was, how it worked. And at the time, my employ was working with companies like British Petroleum, and I was a data analysis, and my job was to gather all the data from the field to be able to answer an essential question to the field manager, which was simply, what is the state of the field now, the oil field? What is the state of the oil field? And in order to make that determination, there were meters on everything. I mean, literally everything had a meter. We had meters on lights, on pipes, on people, on trucks, on generators. Everything had a meter, and we would gather all that data, and we would be able to determine, in answer to the field manager, what is the state of the field now? Well, when they showed me what a standard was, my light bulb went off, because a standard to me was analogous to a meter. And just as Bob showed you, a proficiency scale has its ranges. You know, you've got, you know, the scale he showed 0 through 4, and you got this, and you can put these little conceptual meters, if you will, on anything, on an assessment, on an activity, on a project, whatever it might be. And the more meters you get on these things, the more accurate you can answer a new question. And the new question that really struck me is to be able to answer, what is the state or what does the student know now? We could accurately, very specifically answer what does the student know now, because we wanted to be able to use that to drive instruction as well, to answer the corollary, what does the student need to learn next? And so thus begun our endeavor into trying to create technical tools to be able to digitally express this, what I think is a wonderful approach to education. Well, in order to do that, there was a lot of trial and error, a lot of lessons learned, which I won't necessarily go into, but there are a lot of needs to really rethink how you do scoring, how you maybe even construct a class, how you provide different opportunities for learners and all this kind of stuff. And that's primarily what Empower has been designed to do. The number one essential question that we build Empower to do is to answer that one driver, which is, what does the student know now? And in that, we have done so much to be able to really expand on that, to meet all kinds of stuff like eligibility and high school graduation and all kinds of different little things that do get modified through this model. Like, for instance, Bob went through and he explained a really unique or different approach. It's different scoring proficiency scales than it is scoring just a regular, more traditional, even though they share similar concepts. But the key thing, which is different, and it almost sounds strange to tease out, is a traditional model is going to track and monitor accuracy, which you think, well, of course, it's 100%, you got 80%. Well, that's an accuracy term. And the model that we're employing is using accuracy, but it's expressing in knowledge demonstrated. And it seems, it might, just thinking about it on the surface, it might seem, well, that's a strange thing to try to tease out. But a good example of that could be, let's say I had a quiz, a test for just terminology, maybe foundational learning. And the student gets 100% on that. From an accuracy standpoint, that's 100. And you say, well, that's an A. From a proficiency scale standpoint, that definition terminology, that foundational kind of basic understanding is only in the 2. So we would express it as a 2, whereas we would have 100%. It starts to become more compounded when you have assessments. Let's take something like a common end of chapter or end of quarter assessment, where you are assessing many concepts, many standards, if you will, many skills. And then what you're going to do typically is you would get one accuracy reading of that assessment. And you might get a 70. And the best that can tell you, without deep diving into it, is your student has demonstrated some strengths and some weaknesses, but you really can't tease that out. I mean, you literally have to get the assessment out and go question by question and try to tease that out. That accuracy meter doesn't really tell you as much as you need. But with the proficiency, each one of those skills gets its own score in relation to the level of the proficiency scale that you designed that assessment to target, and you get a very, very, very specific output. So you can answer that key question as far as, what does the student know now? And that's what we've done for the last 18 years, is to develop tools, technical tools, digital tools to be able to manage this whole system. And there's lots of things that Sean could share with you if you wanted to dig deeper into, well, what does it look like? That wasn't the purpose of today's meeting. We're not trying to do a demo or anything, but we just want you to know that if you could agree with some of those key statements that enticed me, we believe that students should be met at the point of their need. They should have the foundational knowledge mastered before they go on to new levels of, or new endeavors of learning, and that you believe students may learn in different ways in different times. If you can not check all those three off, then the type of approach that Bob is talking about today, type of technology that we are supporting, is right in line with your thinking too. And I think I'll just stop it right there. I'm not sure if there's anything else that you guys would like me to cover.
No, all good, all good.
That's great. Perfect. So we do have a few questions that have come in, and I'd like to take a few minutes and address those before we conclude the session overall. So first question, I think Dr. Marzano, this one will be for you. I've heard Dr. Marzano say, assess more, test less. Could you please explain that?
Sure. I kind of tacitly address that. Technically, an assessment is anything that you do to gather information about an individual or group, information about a student's status on a particular topic at a particular time. Now, a type of assessment is a traditional test. I showed a lot of those. But there are other types of assessments, as like the probing discussion, student-generated assessment, personal tracking matrices. Those are all types of assessments, but they're not tests. So that's where it comes from. That actually, that's a little phrase we've coined, and we really mean it, that there should be probably less paper pencil tests, traditional, but a whole lot more of the other types of assessments. And you'll be gathering more information and scoring tests less. So that's what I just presented is kind of like the pieces and parts of how you would do that. Assess more, but test less.
Good. We had another question that was related to that, that maybe both of you may have a crack at. So in a CBE system that uses assessments like probing discussions and student-centered assessments, do you inherently have different numbers of scores for different students? And how does that affect summative scoring? So like, how do we address that? Different numbers of pieces of evidence.
I'll start, Scott, if you don't mind.
Please.
Actually, that paper, that PDF, if you download, has a whole section on that. Sorry, I get choked up over this. It was a joke. I am choked up. Yeah, that'll happen. In general, the more sure you are about a student status, the less testing you have to do, the less sure, the more testing, the less assessment you have to do, the less sure, the more assessment. Yeah, so you might have on a single topic over a unit that there are some students that, you've collected 3 data points and that's it. Or technically, just even 2, they're at this level. And there are other students you've collected 7, because you're not sure. But see, if you're not sure, that's where you go back and use probing discussions, observations. It's not like you have to create another test. So if you use all the complete array of options for assessment, it's very easy to collect a lot of data, and you don't have to collect the same amount of data on each student. Sorry.
Yeah, I have nothing to add to that. I think who can add to Bob, who has 53 years in here? So
yeah, I would just add to that Scott has developed over the last 18 years a way to address that issue and to determine summative scores using the calculations, the summative calculations that Dr. Marzano mentioned that exist in the white paper. So that's manifest within our platform. So it helps wade through that variability.
Yeah, I mentioned that I started, being interested in CBE and writing about it in the early 1990s. So that's a long time ago. Why are we still talking about it? Because it takes technology to deliver on the promise of competency-based education. No kidding. Without the technology that exists now, I firmly believe Empower has the best technology for competency-based education. It is very difficult to do. But once you have the technology, these things like collecting a lot of data points, and analyzing them, they're done automatically. All you do is put the data in, it gets analyzed for you, and even a recommended summative score. So CBE is now, possible, much more possible than it was 20, 30 years ago.
Just to kind of underscore what Bob was saying, as far as the need for technology. When we change and re-envision education as, we maybe could agree it should be, if you will, when you make that change, you do fix a lot of things in the traditional model, but you create new problems you've never had before. In other words, the traditional model is somewhat had the confines of the usability that was needed in order to be able to produce scores and have something that you could actually do. Well, the problem that we add when we change the model is we create a system where there is a lot more scoring than the old system. And why is that? Well, instead of just giving one score for an assessment, if that assessment is made up of 5 different skills, now you have 5 different scores. And for a teacher to try to isolate and keep track of, all right, this assessment item is for this question or for this proficiency scale at this level, and these 3 questions are at the same proficiency scale at this level, and to calculate all that, you want the teacher to almost be agnostic of that and just have the system output that. The system is aware that this assessment item is targeted for this proficiency scale at this level, finds all the like ones in the assessment and produces that. Another thing that we create as a problem, which is not necessarily the topic of today's, but just to kind of keep it in this vein, is if you really do decide to use the data where you are now able to know exactly what the needs of the students are and address those needs instead of addressing the syllabus, right? Before, it was one ubiquitous need. It was called the syllabus. We just went through the syllabus. We just went through the lesson plan. Everybody was on the same pace. Now, if you use the data and you actually want to meet the students at their needs, and that starts to become differentiated, you have a classroom now that is harder to manage, because you may not just need one lesson plan anymore. You might need multiple to meet those needs. And again, technology can automatically, if you will, create those differentiated lesson plans on a day-to-day, moment-by-moment basis, so teachers can manage these things. So these are two big things why we really need the technology, because, and I can tell you, in the early days, when our tools were not nearly as sophisticated, these are the types of comments we had. We had teachers, and this is lamentable, but we had teachers tell us, I'm spending so much time scoring that it's affecting what I can actually do in the classroom. And that's a statement that a good model cannot have incorporated into it. So there's a lot of really important needs for technology.
Good. Okay, I think we have, let's just take one more question and then we'll wrap things up. So our last question is, and then they put in quotes, finished creating our scales, but have not yet aligned our benchmark assessments to those. How can the center help us since we have limited curriculum folks?
It sounds like an alignment question. I'm looking to see whether, well, that's the type of work we do on a consulting basis. That's why we set up the center. Mm-hmm. So anything curriculum and assessment, the center relative to competency-based education, we feel like we have expertise in, and we'd be happy to do that. We'd have to see the data.
Yeah.
And Sean is the person to call about that if you want.
Yeah. And I'll just, to wrap us up here, let me go ahead and share screen, and I'll put us back over into the presentation. We'll wrap up here, and We have taken questions. So just the last thing there is my contact info. It's also on our website. So just in case anybody does have follow-up questions, maybe we didn't get to a question that you wanted to submit or you did submit, please submit those to me and I'm happy to help. But again, we'll be sending out the recording for this afterwards. So just keep an eye out and thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate the time you spent with us.